4 legacy of 1848 conferences. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Yogi, and thanks so much for coming tonight.
Thank you, John. Moin, moin. As John said, my name is Joachim Reppmann, better known as for Yogi. And in the age of 12, I started reading Wild West novels from the German author Karl May, nearly unknown in America. He wrote 54 books, nearly 600 pages each, and 700 million copies had been sold so far. So that got me started in interest in America. Then shortly before I finished high school in 1976, I read Jack Kerouac on the Road, had saved secretly some money, and after high school, 76, flew to America and hitchhiked half a year around America. And since then, Gita and I were commuting, but lately because of COVID and several other reasons, we are now mainly in Northfield, and very soon we will have the American citizenship as a second citizenship. I hope that tonight we not only start new friendships, I would love to do with all of us, with all of you, a project between kind of historians and genealogists. In order to please you in the beginning, I introduced two genius genealogists. One guy is called Scott Christiansen, and he is from Devonport originally, now in Iowa City, and workaholic as a businessman. With 60, he retired and had no hobbies, so he had supported his mom in Devonport doing genealogy, and together they discovered that they have a 1848 revolutionary from Schleswig-Holstein as a great-grandfather. So in my English dissertation in footnote 135, I mentioned that guy, and as a dingbat, I even had spelled the name wrong. It's Jürgen Ankerson. And fortunately, in my English translation of the dissertation, I had an email address. So he contacted me, and out of that genealogist historian relationship became a very close friendship. And you will hear more from Scott Christiansen. Second, a German genealogist, Jochen Meggers, on the very right. He had found the oldest document of his family in 1491, before even Columbus discovered America. So you will hear from him as well. His name is Jochen Meggers, from a tiny village in Schleswig-Holstein, north of Hamburg, south of Denmark, Klein-Benneberg, which is connected with New Holstein and especially Sheboygan. 1848, February. France, Paris was known for high-quality revolutions. The French Revolution, 1789, the next revolution, 1830 in Paris, and then in February 1848 again in Paris, France. And that 1848 revolution was spreading more or less all over Europe. It also came to what is now my home state of Schleswig-Holstein. I have a map here to the right-hand side. You see on top the Kingdom of Denmark. Then you see Herzogtum, Dukedom Schleswig, and then you see a red border, Dukedom of Holstein. The history, and we do not go down this path, of Schleswig-Holstein is so complicated that Lord Palmerston, the Henry Kissinger of his time at a peace conference in 1852, in London, as the Secretary of State from England in London said, the history of Schleswig-Holstein, only 3 men had understood. The first one was a professor, and he got insane. The second one was a diplomat, and the third one is myself, and I have forgotten everything. So this is not what we go in, but before the backdrop, nowadays, Schleswig-Holstein is one of the German states. To the left-hand side, you see a church in Frankfurt, St. Paul Church, the Paul's Church, which became, in May of 1848, the building, the first German parliament. Germany as a nation did not exist. 39 independent principalities from all these German-speaking areas, politicians were voted into that building, and they started a wonderful constitution, which is even parts of that working now in Germany of today. Schleswig-Holstein at that time had been part of Denmark, of the Kingdom of Denmark. When the revolution started, the German-speaking Schleswig-Holsteiners, 90% of the 2 dukedoms, decided we don't want to be part of Denmark anymore. They started a liberty army, Schleswig-Holstein, against Denmark. And one of the main persons you will get to know is Theodor Olshausen, second from right. He became a member as a journalist, trained lawyer of the provisional government of Schleswig-Holstein, 1848. As John mentioned, stressed already, all over Europe, that democratic revolution failed, and Theodor Olshausen went with that ship from Hamburg to Half Brothers to St. Louis. We have a map of the Midwest. The black area nowadays, these are Americans with German roots. Over 50% of the population of the counties. So you can see the Midwest, mainly the Midwest, was the location of a chain mass migration from Germans. The second hero, another journalist, trained lawyer and college buddy of Theodor Olshausen, is Hans Reimer Claussen. Hans Reimer Claussen was voted as a Democrat into the first German parliament in Frankfurt. He died 1894. So 100 years later, 1994, I used that centennial of his death to organize my first 1848 conference. The legacy of 1848, we call it Claussen Centennial. And the genealogist and businessman, Jochen Meggers, gave the money for that brochure in green and English and German. We also published a book, and there's a photo of Hans Reimer Claussen as a younger politician. A jump in time, forward. Quad City Times, Devonport, Bettendorf, Rock Island, and Moline on the Illinois side and Iowa side. 4 cities, Quad Cities, have a newspaper, Quad City Times, and there was a journalist, late John, who had a strong interest as a historian, and he was surprised about the history of Devonport, which he didn't know. because of the two world wars, that part of American history was, at least for a longer time, kind of forgotten, neglected. Here, he called these two journalist lawyers in Devonport, Olshausen and Claussen, German imprint remains strong. Theodor Olshausen had moved from St. Louis, his half-brothers who were running a newspaper in St. Louis, up to Devonport, to his college buddy Claussen, and the house where Olshausen had lived 1856 through 1860 in Devonport, behind me, that's still around, and nowadays you can get it too. I mentioned the Liberty Army in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, against Denmark. After the failed revolution, after the failed war of freedom, liberty, 25 years later, veteran groups all over Schleswig-Holstein had been founded, and by far the largest group of veterans of that liberty war against Denmark happened to be in Devonport. And we have a group photo next to the newspaper article. Now, after looking to Devonport, we move over to Wisconsin, New Holstein. Very unusual for German immigrants. Normally, German immigrants were kind of the second wave. They were not at the frontier founding towns. Most European 48ers did not really had that ambition as the Schleswig-Holstein founders of New Holstein. We have on the lower left, Professor George Hanssen. And since his brother, a journalist from Schleswig-Holstein, Andreas Andy F. Hanssen, Frederick Hanssen, we do not have a photo. So I'm using, just to make it a little bit nicer, Rudolf Puchner is on the right-hand side, 1849. Very unusual. He came from southern Germany, Baden-Württemberg, where Mercedes and Porsches produced these days, and became a shopkeeper, and later, very well off, started writing poetry, published his poetry and so on. So that is not Andreas, but the letters from Andreas F. Hanssen from New Holstein to his very famous brother Georg in Göttingen, which in those days was kind of the Harvard University in Europe, are fascinating. And I will speak later how we found them and why I think, perhaps as a collective project, we should publish those early letters from New Holstein to his brother Georg in Göttingen. So here we have one of these letters. Andreas had hoped that his brother and family would come to New Holstein. And the brother obviously had indicated an interest in, after the failed revolution, to move away from Germany, from Göttingen, from Europe, over to Wisconsin. So we have a map in one of these letters by Andreas. The story of Andreas is that he was the publisher, editor-in-chief of the Altona Mercury, and it was called Intelligenzblatt, very classic 19th century, the in a way, the elite intelligent newspaper, a weekly. And in those days, Altona, which is now a part of Hamburg, very close to downtown even, but in 1848, Altona was, after Copenhagen, the second biggest city in the Kingdom of Denmark. So they didn't speak a word of Danish, but in those days, before nationalism, nation states came into being. That was not unusual. Here we have Theodor Olshausen, the guy from the provisional government. He ran before 1848, before the revolution started, a very good newspaper out of Kiel. You may know Kiel Canal. Now Kiel is the capital of the state of Schleswig-Holstein. And his letters, actually even from childhood, we discovered in formerly East Germany, because of the end of the Second World War, they ended up in a salt mine, and the Red Army did not give those archives, that archive back to West Berlin or West Germany. And then 3 weeks after we discovered those letters, the peaceful revolution had started out of Leipzig, 1989. We published those letters in a book, so far only in German. You have Theodor Olshausen. This is now how we discovered in 1978, the very first college paper, the governor of the state of Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, a trained PhD historian, Dr. Gerhard Stoltenberg, felt sorry for my college buddy and myself, and we became money from taxpayers' money to travel for 3 months to the Midwest. We came to New Holstein. We wanted to have a good time, and out of New Holstein, honest college boys, we wrote to the governor out of a pub and just told him what we are doing with his money, drinking wonderful Wisconsin beer. But in New Holstein, we discovered the 1848ers from Schleswig-Holstein in America. There was a museum. And in the last years, I haven't been to New Holstein, but New Holstein Historical Society is still very active. And in those days, it was amazing what we saw. We are looking to a couple, and they came from Schleswig-Holstein, very well off, via Brazil to New Holstein, Wisconsin. Not unusual. After the failed revolution, officers from that Liberty Army were hired by Brazil to fight for independence. Then on the lower right-hand side, there is a document from Joachim Schildhauer. Joachim Schildhauer came from Schleswig-Holstein, also very well off, highly educated. Those guys spoke Latin and had often already an amazing command of English. And with the revolution of 1848, starting in Cincinnati, all over the Midwest, Turner clubs were founded. These are gymnastic clubs. And the motto was liberty, freedom, education, and well-being for all. That was the lifestyle, the political program of the democratic revolutionaries all over Europe. Here we have Joachim Schildhauer and his son, Eduard, for example, invented the lock system for the Panama Canal. Lately, we have sometimes the possibility to motivate journalists who had visited us or who have an interest in 48ers and the Schleswig-Holstein migration to the Midwest. And here in the center, you see New Holstein, ein Stückchen Heimat in der neuen Welt, a little piece of Heimat in the new world. Then coming from Flensburg, Schleswig-Holstein, border town to Denmark, from the north to the Wild West, welcome to Flensburg, USA. North of Minneapolis, west of Little Falls is a little town. Nowadays, 210 inhabitants, and Polish Catholic immigrants founded Flensburg, Minnesota. Nobody knows why they chose Flensburg. But I want to point out sort of the challenges of the German Americans when America entered the First World War in April 1917. Look to the poster, destroy this mad brute. So Americans with German background had the reputation, possibly they might support the German Kaiser. So there were really problems, and the term sauerkraut was not politically correct, so it was renamed to Liberty Cabbage. Many things. The Boston Orchestra didn't play Beethoven anymore. We are back in New Holstein, Wisconsin, 1978. To the left, you see Sis Pauli, maiden name Langenfeld. And already in 1978, we started working a little bit on our college paper, 15 poorly written pages, and her father, we called him Opa Langenfeld. He ran a bank, he had a copy machine, and he was very supportive from the first second. He thought this was funny that there were these college students who had a strong interest in Wisconsin beer. So Sis, when we came back writing our MA thesis, 1982, and then I came back by myself, 1986, Sis and Greg Pauli and their son and daughter-in-law, Kathy and Jeff Pauli, were of super support in terms of homestays and so on. In Kiel, Wisconsin, already 1978, a teacher, Irene Krostark, and now lately Jack Lechler, an activist in Kiel, Wisconsin, nearby New Holstein, who is really working hard on the friendship in between Kiel, Wisconsin, and Kiel, Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. One thing with Opa Langenfeld, Adolf Langenfeld, the banker, there was a famous singer from New Holstein, Hildegarde. She went to Milwaukee and then to New York City, sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of records. The Swedish king was madly in love with her, the Duke of Winston. So she had an amazing career, wrote a great book, which I lately bought and read. But Opa Langenfeld, whysoever, he never told us, did not like her. So in New Holstein, in those days, she was kind of forgotten, and I was glad on the website they had an exhibition about her in the New Holstein Historical Society. And I think this is cute. I don't know the background of this here, but land of peace and plenty. This was exactly the pull force, the poor farmhands. People were starving in Europe, in Germany, in Schleswig-Holstein, even though they worked hard. So the mass migration was mainly because of economic and social reasons, and very few Europeans, Germans, Schleswig-Holsteiners came because of political or religious reasons. I had mentioned Altona. Altona in Northern Europe in those days, the second biggest city after Copenhagen in the Kingdom of Denmark. In New Holstein, to this day, you have the Altona Supper Club, and the placemat gives the early history of these 48ers in New Holstein. And originally, it was called the village of Altona. But since there is an Altona spelled with a double O, west, quite a bit west, but the mail got confused or not delivered right. That's when some years later, the village of Altona was renamed to village of New Holstein. 1982, my college friend and I bought this Impala in New York for $300, 8 cylinders, super quality car. We had the best time and came back to New Holstein and really studied hard for our MA thesis. We are now traveling from New Holstein, Wisconsin, a short way, a few miles to Kiel, Wisconsin. And here we saw the Holstein cow and the flag of Schleswig-Holstein at this bar. And Kiel, with a former Prussian officer, Belitz, but nobody is really sure how close he was to Kiel, Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, is kind of the founder of Kiel. Now, there is still, because of Jack Lechler, some contact between the big sister city, Kiel, Germany, Schleswig-Holstein, and Kiel, Wisconsin. Moving back to these three journalists, Andreas F. Hanssen in New Holstein and Theodor Olshausen, Reimer, Claussen in Devonport. They all were competing for more immigrants from Schleswig-Holstein. More immigrants meant more money. And fighting homesickness for your choir, singing songs in German and so on. You needed more immigrants. Here we have Hans Reimer Claussen, very unusual. He knew, together with Theodor Olshausen, he was excluded from the general amnesty by the Danish king in order to avoid prison. He had to leave Schleswig-Holstein, part of Denmark, Europe, and he came via New York to Devonport. First letter from New York to friends in Schleswig-Holstein, and it was very typical that these letters by people who were great writers were published in the newspaper Itzehoer weekly newspaper, and he describes New York. And the impressions he had from New York is the same how you guys and I would describe New York today. So nothing has changed. The lawyer, journalist, started a career as a lawyer again. He had to study again, became a state senator in Des Moines, and twice he traveled from Devonport back home with the same trunk and suitcase which he had used for his trips from Schleswig-Holstein as a member of the first German parliament to Frankfurt. Theodor Olshausen, son of a Lutheran pastor, newspaper editor since 1830 in Kiel, and then politician in the provisional government, came first to St. Louis, then, because of his college buddy, came to Devonport, running the German newspaper, which became a daily newspaper. And then he went back, 1860, shortly before the Civil War, and he took over the Westliche Post, the largest German-speaking newspaper west of New York. And the Olshausen family had the newspaper through to the 1930s, and Joseph Pulitzer, German-speaking, Jewish background from Budapest, Hungary, his first job as an investigative journalist was with the Westliche Post, and after some years, he moved to New York and the Pulitzer Prize. Well, all that is history. In 1870, just to give you an idea why and how the Germanic immigration was by far the largest ethnic group which ever showed up at the American shore. 1870, there were around about 1,400 daily, weekly, monthly publications in the German language in America. Little towns like Schleswig, Iowa, Western Iowa, Holstein, Western Iowa. They had maybe, even in my days, 1978, 500 inhabitants and had a newspaper in English, sure, later. So that was gigantic. Here, back to Devonport, talking about journalists and a wonderful love story. Another interesting 48er, Bleik Peters from the island of Sylt, west of my hometown, the island now for the rich and famous. And his wife, Tilde Henningsen, she was actually the megastar. She spoke 4 languages. She was a dash smarter, better educated than these 48ers. She wrote poems which were published in the German newspaper. And I hope that one of these days somebody will write a PhD dissertation, scientific biography about Tilde Henningsen. 1898, 50 years after the democratic revolution in Europe, in Kiel, Schleswig-Holstein, the veterans who were still alive gathered in Devonport, downtown, next to the Mississippi, and they had this stone. 1,400 people came to the inauguration of that monument, March 24th, 1848. And they had this veteran organization and a German speech, an English speech, wonderful. The stone was 4 tons heavy. Keep that in mind, 4 tons. Commemorating the 1848ers, the big avenue in the State University of Kiel for Schleswig-Holstein is the Olshausen Straße. And there were 2 brothers, Theodor Olshausen and his brother, Justus Olshausen, who became the boss of all universities in Germany later. But after the failed revolution, he had to go away, and the famous German scientist Humboldt, they had planned as a research trip to Persia, organized a job for him in Königsberg, where the German philosopher Immanuel Kant had lived. And in memory of those 2 brothers who gave the name to that big grand avenue at the university, we raised some money and have this 1848 commemoration with a quote from Theodor in one of his letters from St. Louis to his brother. And because of the media attention, after we had the big party for that, Bruno Olshausen, a famous neuroscientist from Berkeley, San Francisco, California. He's running a team of 28 scientists who had been on sabbatical in Berlin with colleagues, came over. It was July 4th, by the way, and wanted to see that monument. So we have Bruno. So with genealogy, with his history background, you run into wonderful friendships. I had stressed that 48ers, in general, Germans on the frontier, were the exception of the rule. There's one other great story when a young lawyer, journalist, took over the Kiel weekly correspondence newspaper, which had been founded by Theodor Olshausen, 1830, 1848. He became a politician, and he gave that highly talented young man, Friedrich Hedde, the newspaper. You see the name. Hedde had problems. The King of Denmark didn't put him into prison, but he couldn't work as a lawyer. So 1856, he came to Davenport, Iowa, and there were rumors in Washington that the national capital will be moved to a central location in America. It sounds weird nowadays, but on state level, it had happened like 158 times. For example, in Iowa, first Iowa City, and then Des Moines, the capital. So what is nowadays Grand Island, Nebraska? In those days, it was the Nebraska Territory, according to the rumors in 1856, would be the future national capital. And a bank in Davenport gave the money, and under the leadership of Friedrich Hedde, a group of Schleswig-Holsteiners, also some 48ers, moved via Omaha, in those days, 2,000 inhabitants, and founded Grand Island. They wanted to name it originally New Kiel, but there was a reason why it didn't was that name. So then, to have more immigrants, Friedrich Hedde was writing to German newspapers, and then the state of Nebraska, even for 2.5 years, gave money that Hedde could move back to Hamburg and influence Germans, immigrants going to Nebraska. We are dreaming. Scott Christiansen, the genealogist from Iowa City, formerly Davenport, one of these days, if pigs could fly, if a rich German or a rich American will give us the money, we would love to start a professional 48er museum, possibly in Davenport, but wherever that money has to be spent. Looking now to New Holstein and Davenport, these journalists like Andreas F. Hanssen in New Holstein, and on the other hand, people like Hans Reimer Claussen, Theodor Olshausen, they knew each other quite well. They were competing to get more Schleswig-Holsteiners to New Holstein and Davenport, and in their letters which were published, they started over the years to blame the others that they were not saying the total truth about Davenport and New Holstein, but like 1856, and then a huge economic crisis in 1857 brought an end to that competition. And with those letters from New Holstein, it is just amazing. We found in the special collection, State Historical Society of Davenport, a microfilm, very, very poor quality. Nobody knows the story in behind, but the letters written by Andreas Hanssen from New Holstein to Göttingen to his famous brother, Professor Georg Hanssen, a agricultural historian. Even nowadays, Wikipedia, many books, and they had been microfilmed, but the quality was so bad that my father, who grew up with his grandma, and he grew up with reading German script, Sütterlin, and for him, he could help many American genealogists deciphering, but he could not decipher. But we took every single slide, so to speak, negative of that microfilm, put it into a slide frame, and projected it to the huge white wall in our cheap student apartment. And for 1 year, we deciphered these fascinating letters when a professional journalist is writing to his brother how democracy, how the first town minutes, 1849 in New Holstein, in perfect English already, had been written and so on, and what kind of challenges. It is the best description of an early settlement. And those town minutes, interestingly enough, ended up in the Area Research Center in Green Bay, which is now part of the Green Bay Archives in the David Coffrin Library, UW Green Bay campus. And I have now a tennis buddy here in Northfield, a police officer from Green Bay, and he never had heard about this area research center. So we have that 48er story, and you will hear more. Now we are moving a little bit kind of general education and a little bit entertaining information. Already 1978, we discovered this building, the Schleswig-Holstein Choir, founded 1883, and they had their own building. Unfortunately, all that is not in existence. My college buddy is sitting on a car, which we had bought 1978 for $150. Only one American in all my talks since 1979 could tell us what kind of car that is. So I'm waiting to the end. Please look at the car, the blue car, $150. And it's a wonderful quality car. So now looking back, moving a little bit briefly back to Schleswig-Holstein, my hometown, Flensburg, half a mile south of Denmark. We have a Danish minority. These are Danes with a German passport. We have a Danish daily newspaper in Flensburg, a Danish high school, Danish kindergarten. So because the border had changed many times, then we have Hamburg, and really in downtown Hamburg is the part Altona, the supper club, and to the left you have Bremerhaven. That's where Elvis Presley, as a GI, landed in 1953. This is now Flensburg. The upper left photo, the big building on top is my high school, Altes Gymnasium, which was founded 1566 by a Danish king. Then to the right, we have Moin Moin, which means howdy in northern Germany, and even a weekly newspaper is called Moin Moin. Then the very best in Flensburg is our local brew, the Flensburg Pils, super quality water. And because of the German version of Beavis and Butthead, this beer is now sold all over Germany. And then the Second World War had ended in Flensburg. April 30th, 1945, Hitler had committed suicide, and hours before he committed suicide, he changed his will. The second Nazi, Hermann Göring in command, and the third, Goebbels, did not get the job of running Nazi Germany, but the admiral of the Nazi German Navy, Dönitz. And Germany was already nearly occupied, but the Navy Academy in my hometown, Flensburg, became sort of the seat of the government, and the World War was over May 8th. Out of Flensburg, all that was organized. And May 23rd, Churchill said, now this Flensburg government is history. we put these guys into prison. So for a long time, this was nearly unknown. Nobody spoke in Flensburg about it, being ashamed, but having American visitors to Flensburg, it is always interesting to tell that part. Low German, it's not lower quality. The lowlands in northern Germany on the countryside have their own language. And thousands, we estimate 500,000 of these 6 to 7 million German-speaking immigrants spoke Low German in the Midwest, in New Holstein, in Devonport, all over the countryside, Low German. And one of these guys who still speak Low German, you might know, Eric Braden, Victor in the soap, The Young and the Restless. He's now for 38 years. He had a minor role in Titanic, and he is from Schleswig-Holstein. With 18 years as an adventurer, he made it to Hollywood, a fine career. And we had a Low German conference in Grand Island, Nebraska, and he was the keynote speaker. 2017, I turned 60, and the last legacy of 1848 was in Northfield, and he came for 5 days, progressive party, and we sometimes visit him, and we used to play tennis, but that's age-wise not possible anymore. And this is Santa Monica, and my wife Gitta, when he takes her out to his favorite Italian restaurant, they sent me to the next diner to enjoy a hamburger, and all my buddies in America and Germany think it's very funny. Talking about genealogy, history research, this is Scott Christensen from Devonport with Jürgen Ankerson, an 1848er from Schleswig-Holstein, who wrote a book, 600 pages, no, over 600 photos. I have it here, 380 pages or so. He was visiting us many years ago for 2 weeks. And we had a good time, but we went to Hamburg, Schleswig-Holstein archives. He did genealogy research. And as a thank you, he wrote that book about his visit for 3 years. Like a workaholic in business, 8 to 12 hours a day, he worked on this book, The Soul of Schleswig-Holstein. I showed you the cover with Lulu printing on demand. It is not cheap because of glossy paper and these over 600 colored photos, most colored photos. It is $80, but it's amazing how he processed the visit as a genealogist. So now I hope that perhaps there is an interest of some of you that we work on these letters. Nowadays, getting them translated, everything is with modern technology so much easier and financially very, very reasonable. Before I come to the end, 2 Lexo nephews from the Schleswig-Holstein West Coast became very prolific newspaper publishers in New York City. Then there were 2 officers from the Schleswig-Holstein Liberty Army who first stayed in Devonport, and one, Eduard Garbin, became editor in New Orleans. So beside New Holstein, Wisconsin, Devonport, and Grand Island, Nebraska, there is even a larger group. So thank you very much for your interest. Please support our upcoming publication, Andreas F. Hanssen's Letters to his brother George. My website, Invention of My Wife, moin-moin.us, is mainly about 1848ers. Thank you again. Hopefully, we will meet one of these days. latest when we have a book party and somehow a genealogy historian event, the legacy of 1888. Thank you for your patience and your interest.
Thank you, Yogi. That's a wonderful, solid presentation. A couple of quick questions, and other people who have questions, you can unmute yourself, and maybe we can take turns asking questions. The two that I had were, what happened to the 48ers who did not come to the United States? And the second question is, were any of the 48 revolutions successful?
The first question, in America, but also in Schleswig-Holstein, in Germany, in Europe, many intellectuals, professors, they lost their job, they couldn't work as lawyers and so on. They committed suicide.
Oh,
so especially, and that's why New Holstein is a success story. The brother, for example, of Opa Langenfeld, he had a big mink farm in 1978. And sure, we saw that mink farm, these little devils in a cage, and they got twice a day special nutrition or so for the nice fur. This is a topic by itself. So these intellectuals were called Latin farmers. They were better in quoting Latin philosophers, authors, than being farmers. And some made it, for example, at Harvard and so on, to get a teaching job. But many struggled, and one had an amazing career. He was from the Cologne area. He was a student, Karl Schurz. Under President Hayes, he became Secretary of Interior Affairs. His wife from Hamburg had founded the first kindergarten, 1856 in Watertown, Wisconsin. So in terms of education, in terms of physical education, especially in terms of culture, orchestras, these were the leading forces in America. And it was just ideal. They failed, they had to leave, and several had wonderful careers. So it is a little bit unfortunate, but the two world wars, when sauerkraut was renamed to Liberty Cabbage and so on, then there was no interest in the legacy of 1848. But that has changed, and step by step, even in Germany, in Europe, a failed revolution. In high school days, I didn't learn anything about that first democratic parliament in Frankfurt, and before the backdrop of German history, especially 1933-45, that there had been a short democratic attempt with a constitution and so on, but the Prussian king didn't want to be the emperor of Germany as the Frankfurt Parliament had planned. So that's why the revolution kind of failed in Germany. What was your second question?
Did the revolution succeed anywhere in Europe?
No.
No. Okay.
The longest revolution period was in Schleswig-Holstein, with that provisional government and with this Liberty Army against Denmark, because in the beginning, in March 1848, end of March, March 24th, immediately that army was kind of invented. The Prussian army had supported the Schleswig-Holstein Liberty Army against Denmark. but then world politics, Russia and Great Britain, England put pressure on Prussia. So when they withdrew, Schleswig-Holstein with their idealistic army was not strong enough to win against Denmark. The final battle in each state, 1850, in January, nearly could have been won by Schleswig-Holstein. But to make a long story short, Schleswig-Holstein, because of that history, had kind of, for the longest success as a revolution.
Does anyone else have any questions for Yogi before we wrap it up for the evening?
I have a question about in Watertown. I have read with my relatives that it was so important to begin working with gymnastics and building the body like the intellectual life, because from what I've got with my records there, it was thought that perhaps we were sort of sloppy with taking care of our bodies, and so that was important to start getting our muscles going.
Judy, thank you for your question. It's a talk by itself, and I'm happy to come back here. It's called Turnverein, and it goes back to the Roman guy Juvenal. There is only a sound mind in a sound body. And there was a guy from Berlin, he moved, Ludwig Jahn. And in 1848, he was not that young. He was a member of that democratic parliament. And 1811, on a ground called Hasenheide in Berlin, he had kind of founded the first Turnverein, and all communities, even Holstein, Iowa, had their Turnverein, and Watertown. So in Devonport, 1852, the son-in-law of Hans Reimer Claussen, who had run the Turnverein already in Kiel, Schleswig-Holstein from 1844, when he came, they founded in 1852 the socialistic Turnverein of Devonport. Socialism, what we think about East Germany, communism or so, the motto was liberty, education, and well-being for all. The word socialism finally was dropped, and the first Turner Hall, a building, 1857, and then a whole section, a gigantic Turner Hall in downtown Devonport. I actually have slides for an encore, so to speak, but then we will be here at midnight. It was the center of all cultural society activities in Devonport. The big dances on Friday night until the 1960s with highball and big bands and so on, they took place in the Turnverein halls.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Yogi?
I'm just looking to the chat, and maybe I just go also 1848 from Germany, elsewhere helped Union win the American Civil War. Very good. Theodor Olshausen in St. Louis, when he came back 1860, his newspaper, the state of Missouri, was flip-flop. It was not sure that Missouri will support the Union. There's an amazing story and quite a bit of research, and a leading charismatic journalist, Theodor Olshausen, was very crucial to keep Missouri 1861 for the Union. I can give that second extra talk. Then we have John Wasserstraß, I love that name, 2017, for the centennial of US entering the war, the German-American Heritage Center had an exhibit showing all the discrimination against, yeah, that is his story. Even in 1978, visiting Devonport for the first time, I got to know a lady who could recall that 1918 with a streetcar, she was like 8, 9 years or so, she spoke German to her mom, and her mom publicly slapped her that she should stop speaking German in public. So that is just a little story. Here is something close to my heart. Is there a way to keep the recording longer? I hope, Peggy, we take you out for the ultimate bar hopping in Hamburg and the best nightclubs. I follow you blindly. I want to teach a class in September. Yes, maybe we can, Peggy, I am your support group. Maybe Carol, Dean, and John might consider that. Stammtisch is the subject line. Sorry about all the chats. Yeah. Yes, we have Stammtisch. I love Stammtisch. Very Germanic. I would like to let you all know about a fun activity. Yeah, Stammtisch. I come to the Stammtisch. I'm addicted to beer. In Germany, you grew up with beer. We even brush our teeth with beer. So therefore, we look at beer not as an alcohol, but a nutrition. That little I'm eating, I can drink. That is our lifestyle. 2 new messages. Any more questions? Sounds wonderful. Thank you for this. It's fine. Thank you. The book 1861 has a long section about the St. Louis German blockage of the Confederates. Yeah, this is really a story by itself. All right.
Yogi, thank you very much.
Thank
Hopefully we
you.
can
It was
get back again someday.
Thank you.
very good. Thank you so very much.
Carol, you made my day. A charming lady.
Thanks. Thank you.
What else can I wish? All the best for your
All right.
future dog sitting, Carol.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Moin,
everybody.
Bye
moin.
night.